both his first love and I fell into the water at the same time. George left me and chose to save his first love. After I crawled ashore with my injured leg, I asked him for a divorce. George looked confused. Regina can't swim. I went to save her. Why are you making such a big deal out of it? Our 5-year-old son looked at me coldly, too. Mom, you're fine. Why are you being so petty? I slapped George across the face, then pinched my son's cheek with a sneer. Yes, I am that petty. George's head jerked to the side from the slap. When he turned back, his lips twitched as he tried to suppress his anger. Stacy, can't you calm down? Henry, being just a child, burst into tears, shouting and struggling. No wonder Dad saved Aunt Regina instead of you. You're just a vicious woman. You deserve to fall into the water. I dragged my aching leg and gave him a smack on his bottom. Yes, I'm a vicious woman. Why don't you go live with Regina and let her be your mother? Regina stepped forward and pushed me aside, pulling Henry into her arms protectively. Out of everyone's sight but mine, she gave me a provocative smile. Stacy, he's just a child. He didn't mean what he said. How could you hit him? Henry, still clinging to Regina, yelled hysterically, I wasn't saying it out of anger. I don't want her to be my mom. She's dumb. She can't ride horses, can't play golf. She's nothing like Aunt Regina. Dad doesn't like her, and neither do I. Before Henry could spill any more of his true feelings, George sternly interrupted, Henry, stop making a scene. With that, he positioned himself in front of the two, as if guarding them. A crying child, a gentle mother, a tall father, ha! What a picture-perfect family of 3. And Regina, still putting on her act. This boy is so sweet and sensible. If it were me, I couldn't bear to raise my hand against him. You're such a heartless mother. I curled my lips into a smile, glaring at her coldly. Say one more word, and I'll make sure the next slap lands on your face. I watched as her smile froze instantly. I let out a scoff, leaving that scumbag and his mistress, and that piece of barbecued pork. I turned and walked away. The next day, I handed George the divorce papers. He frowned, pushing his gold-rimmed glasses up his nose, looking utterly exhausted. This has gone too far. You won't be able to take it back. I'm not joking. Sign it. The assets will be divided according to the prenup. As for Henry, custody will be yours. Henry had inherited George's coldness and cruelty, and his lack of love for me. Rather than forcing him to stay with me, it would be better for him to live with George. George put the papers down, his cold face filled with confusion. All this just because of yesterday? Regina can't swim. I went to save her. What's the big deal? You were fine. Did it really have to lead to divorce? He spoke righteously, as if since I hadn't died in the water, he was in the right. Yesterday, George and I took Henry to the beach. Halfway through, George left for a while. In that short time, he brought Regina over. He claimed they had run into each other on the way, and since she was all alone, he invited her to join us. Seeing my sour expression, Henry, who usually clung only to me, gleefully ran into Regina's arms. Aunt Regina. It's only been a day, but I missed you so much. It was at that moment that I realized George had been in contact with Regina all along. Not only that, he had taken Henry to see her more than once. When I looked at George, his face was grim as he hastily explained, I ran into Regina a few times when I was picking Henry up from school. His flimsy excuse made my heart sink. Later, a huge wave crashed onto the beach. Regina and I were swept into the water together. The tide wasn't rising, and the wave wasn't strong enough to drag anyone under. It felt like a test that forced George to choose between me and Regina. He forgot that I was his wife, forgot that my leg was injured from saving him once before. Without hesitation, he chose to save Regina. So now he asks if it's really necessary? Of course, it is. They can choose not to love me, but I can't choose not to love myself. I looked him straight in the eye and replied word by word, What if I hadn't been okay? What if I hadn't been able to crawl out of the water with my bad leg? George, the only reason I'm standing here asking for a divorce is because I'm still alive. George opened his mouth, and his words came out before he thought, but you are still alive. He stopped mid-sentence, realizing his mistake, awkwardly shifting his gaze away. He took a deep breath, his tone was outwardly calming, but his words carried a threat. If you leave me, without parents or family, where do you think you'll go? I smiled, pushing the papers toward him again. That's none of your concern. Sign it, and consider it repayment for saving your life. George was a proud man. He hated it when I used my life-saving deed to guilt him, and he was certain I wouldn't leave him and abandon our son. He thought I was just throwing a tantrum. But when I brought up that life-saving moment, his face darkened, and he coldly replied, all you ever talk about is saving my life. Fine, let's divorce. But once we're done, don't think I'll agree to get back together so easily. Take this time to reflect on your actions. In the end, I got what I wanted, a divorce certificate. I returned to the house we had lived in for 7 years to pack my things. The house was big, and there were plenty of expensive and delicate items, but the only things that truly belonged to me were just a few scattered bits and pieces. I looked around at all the large and small objects, some expensive, some exquisite. In the end, I went up to the attic and took out the one thing that was mine alone, my easel. I strapped it to my back and left the villa. As I reached the gate, I saw Henry standing on the second-floor balcony, his lips pressed together in a tight line, his little face cold as ice. He stood there silently watching me. Maybe he hoped I would go over to him, just like before, hug him, kiss him, apologize to him. I stopped and glanced back at him, then with a sigh, I softly told him, eat well, sleep well, and take good care of yourself. Mommy won't be around to take care of you anymore. Henry's eyes reddened as he turned his head with a cold snort. If you're leaving, then go. Aunt Regina will take care of me anyway. I don't need you. I paused for a moment but said nothing more. With the setting sun behind me, I walked away with my easel. Henry wasn't always like this. Before Regina came back, he was sweet and caring. When other kids made fun of him because I couldn't ride horses or play golf, he would always defend me with a serious face. So what if she can't? As my mom, all she needs to do is love me enough. But after Regina returned from abroad, and after George took him to meet her a few times, it was as if Henry had turned into someone else. The son who once only loved me began to resent me for not coming from a wealthy family and even stopped letting me pick him up from kindergarten. When his friends came over to our house, he told me to stay out or not come home at all. Even on the day of my parents' memorial, when I cried, he coldly scolded me for being ungraceful. Looking back now, Henry and George are truly father and son. They love the same people and hate the same ones, like loving Regina and hating me. After realizing George didn't love me, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't bear the betrayal, but I also couldn't let go of Henry. Yet the way he treated me made my attachment feel like a joke. The road out of the villa wasn't long, but it took me 7 years to walk it. As I walked down the path under the sunset, my mind drifted back to the past. 15 years ago, my father died saving George's father. My mother died soon after from heartbreak. When I was little, I ended up at their house. George was their only child, the proud and pampered young master. Yet despite his arrogance, he was kind to me as a boy, so kind that I couldn't help but fall for him, even though it was just one-sided. Until he fell in love with Regina and started dating her. That's when I buried my feelings for him deep inside. Even when they broke up later, I no longer harbored hopes of being with him. But then, after an accident where I saved his life, he began seeking me out on his own. With his parents' support, he started pursuing me. He was the one I had quietly loved for years. I couldn't say no to him. In the end, after his relentless pursuit, I gave in, and we got together. We married in due course, and I gave birth to Henry. I thought we'd be together for the rest of our lives, but Regina's return shattered that dream. 3 months ago, I went to pick him up after he'd been drinking. At the door of the private room, I overheard his friends mention Regina. Regina's back. What are you thinking? He leaned his head on his hand, swirling his wine glass with the other, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. What can I think? I'm married now. His friends egged him on. But what if you weren't? You two were so in love back then. You almost died for her. George let out a bitter laugh. What are you even talking about? Oh, I forgot, it was your wife who saved you that time, when she hurt her leg. Yeah, for that debt, you can't betray her, right? The bitterness in George's smile was enough to cut through me. I didn't dare step forward. It was at that moment that I realized he never loved me. What he felt for me was just guilt. I had been trapped in his lies for 7 years. Luckily, it wasn't too late. In the twilight, I would finally reclaim my freedom. I moved into the hotel I had booked earlier. That night, I received a call from George's parents. They didn't know yet that George and I had divorced. They kindly asked when I would bring Henry back to visit them for dinner. I thought of George's father's high blood pressure. The words "George and I are divorced" almost slipped out, but I swallowed them. I just shook my head and said I was busy. After hanging up, I texted George, "Your parents just called and asked when I'd bring Henry to visit." I dodged it this time, but you should tell them about our divorce soon. A long while later, he replied, "Got it." I felt I had done all I could. From now on, George and I would have nothing to do with each other. I thought about it and decided to block his number for good. That night, I caressed the drawing board I'd brought from the villa. I remembered the wish I made as a child in my parents' arms. When I grow up, I want to be a great artist. Back then, my parents lovingly patted my head, smiling warmly. Our little Stacy will be the best artist in the world. But later, I married into the Pei family. I never picked up a paintbrush again. At that time, George's parents had hinted, "Stacy, you should study this." George is studying it too. I was young and lacked conviction, dazzled by a life that wasn't mine. I gave up my dream and walked a path that wasn't meant for me. This old drawing board, now yellowed, is like the dream I forgot. No matter how I tried to clean it, the stains remained. But after a while, the stains faded. Looking at the newly brightened surface, I finally smiled. I pulled out the brushes I had bought from a small shop earlier that evening, set the paper down, and tried to sketch the scenes of my childhood. Just as the tip of the brush touched the paper, my phone rang. The number was familiar. It was George's assistant, Jacob. "Madam, Mr. George has been drinking after a business dinner and insists on seeing you. Would you be able to come and get him?" Whenever George got drunk in the past, he would always make a fuss for me to pick him up. His assistant was used to calling me. But now, George and I were divorced. I set my brush down and replied softly yet firmly, "I'm sorry, I'm not available. Mr. George and I are divorced. Please don't call me about him again." Suddenly, I heard the sound of something breaking over the phone. I paused for a moment, then added, "You can check Mr. George's phone. There's someone named Regina. She's more suited to pick him up than I am." Just as I was about to hang up, I heard a strange noise from the other end. The next second, George's hoarse voice, laced with barely suppressed anger, came through the speaker. "Stacy, are you really going to just leave me? I thought I must be hearing things." After all, someone who cheated shouldn't be speaking with such righteous indignation. I chuckled softly, told Jacob goodbye, and hung up. I picked up my brush again, pouring all my tangled thoughts onto the canvas. I went to bed late that night, so when my phone rang the next morning, I couldn't help but answer irritably, "Who's calling this early?" On the other end, it was the housekeeper from the villa. She spoke cautiously, "Stacy, Henry is sick. Mr. George left early this morning, and I can't reach him. Could you come home and see Henry?" Hearing that Henry was sick, my heart immediately filled with worry. No mother can stay calm after hearing her child is unwell, even if that child doesn't love her. I froze for a few seconds before replying, "I'll come right away." When I entered Henry's room, he was lying alone in bed. My heart ached as I quickly walked over and touched his forehead. "Are you feeling sick?" When Henry saw me, his eyes reddened, and for a moment, a trace of hurt flashed across his face. But the next second, he knocked my hand away. He rolled over, pulling the blanket over his head, and mumbled, "You left. Why did you come back? You shouldn't be here." Henry rarely got sick as a child. Seeing him like this, so fragile, the walls I had recently built around my heart crumbled. I sat on the edge of the bed and gently pulled the blanket down a bit so he could breathe. Then I saw his flushed little face and tear-filled, swollen eyes. I froze for a moment, guilt flooding over me. He was only 5 years old. What could he understand? His dislike for me, his closeness to Regina, were all because of George's influence. He was like a blank sheet of paper. He would grow into whoever those around him wanted him to be. Why was I holding a grudge against a 5-year-old? The more I thought about it, the more I felt sorry for him, and my voice began to choke up. "Henry, I'm sorry. Mommy shouldn't have left you. I shouldn't have abandoned you here. Yes, I couldn't leave Henry with George. He was so young. There was still time to fix everything." The more I thought, the more resolute I became. I leaned down and hugged Henry gently, speaking softly, "Henry, come with Mommy, okay? Mommy will renegotiate with Daddy about custody." I could feel Henry's defenses weakening. He even snuggled a little closer to me, as if the sweet, loving Henry the first used to know had returned. He stayed in my arms for a long time before finally mumbling, "Don't bother. You'll never get custody of me." I stroked his head, my voice firm. "Mommy will trade everything I got in the divorce for you." Henry pushed me away, his red and swollen eyes meeting mine. In his innocent voice, he said the cruelest words, "With Dad, I have a nanny to take care of me, a luxury car to ride in, and I go to the best schools. But with you, you can't give me any of that. Besides, Dad won't let you have me. You can't leave this house without me." I went silent for a moment, my throat tight, the words hard to get out. "Mommy will try to talk to your daddy." Henry's face was stern as he coldly cut off my futile attempt. "Mom, I'm not going with you, and you don't belong here. When Regina came back, you should have stepped aside. Just leave. Don't come back. I don't want to see you anymore. From now on, Aunt Regina will be my mom." I've heard these words before, but it still hurts. Tears streaming down my face, I stared blankly at the child I carried for 10 months. He turned his head away, his small finger pointing at the door. "Go out. I don't want to see you again." I didn't move. I just kept looking at him. The next moment, he threw a cup at my feet. With a loud bang, the flying shards cut into my ankle, and a thin line of blood appeared. As the sharp pain shot through my ankle, I suddenly felt that my regret upon entering was like a joke. Henry wasn't influenced by George. He was cold-blooded by nature and didn't like me. I took 2 steps back and turned to leave his room. As I stepped out, I couldn't help but turn back and say, "Henry, once I leave, I really won't come back." In response, I heard another cup shatter. I wiped my tears and walked away without looking back. As I exited, I ran into the housekeeper. She looked at me with concern, then glanced at Henry's room. "Did Henry make you angry again?" I shook my head and quietly told her, "It was me who made him angry, and don't bring up his matters to me anymore. He doesn't want to see me." After saying that, I left quickly, leaving the housekeeper behind. From a distance, I vaguely heard her say, "How could this child not love you? He calls your name even in his dreams." I wiped away the fresh tears and shook my head. How could that be? He had repeatedly told me that he didn't need me. On the way back, I looked at the familiar scenes along the street. Suddenly, the city felt terrifyingly unfamiliar. My phone kept vibrating with calls from unknown numbers. When I answered, it was George's voice. "Stacy, Henry is sick. Why didn't you stay to be with him?" I scoffed, hatred rising in my chest. "George, everything is going as you wished. Henry doesn't want me as his mother anymore. You must be feeling pretty smug right now." George hurriedly tried to explain, his voice anxious. I didn't mean it that way. I just wanted him to not dislike Regina. I couldn't contain my emotions anymore and shouted, "So you chose to make him hate me, is that it?" "Stacy, that wasn't my intention. I wanted Henry to accept Regina so you wouldn't resist her so much." I interrupted him with a cold laugh. "George, tell me, why should I accept Regina, the woman who intruded on my marriage?" George fell silent for a long time, long enough for me to lose the desire to argue with him. I hung up the phone, staring out at the passing trees outside. I suddenly didn't want to stay in the city anymore. I clutched my phone tightly and spoke to the driver in the front seat, "Take me to Bee City. That's my parents' hometown. I missed them." I submitted my resignation, went back to the hotel to pack my things, and headed to Bee City. I admit I am a coward. I'm afraid of not being resolute, of compromising for Henry in that hopeless abyss. After all, in my youth, I gave up painting for a secret crush. I hadn't picked up a brush for over 10 years. Occasionally, when I felt nostalgic, I would take out my sketch pad and hesitate about starting over, but each time I lost to the busyness of work and Henry's repeated calls of Mom. Now that I'm divorced, those shackles no longer exist. I feel like I've been reborn. Maybe I should thank Henry. If he were a little more attached, I might still be struggling in that abyss. But everything now is the best arrangement. I will take my sketch pad and slowly find the youthful self I once had. In Bee City, I rented a small place and began my journey of living alone. Life became colorful, like the hues in an oil painting, bright and free. I spent my days carrying my sketch pad outside and my nights curled up in my small room with a book. During my sketching outings, I made a group of unfamiliar friends. Most of them were retired middle-aged men and women or students from nearby art preparatory classes. We never arranged to meet but would always stumble upon each other in beautiful locations. Then we would paint the green lake, the golden leaves, and the stunning evening glow together. At first, I could never get it right. Whenever someone passed by, I would shyly hide my work. I was afraid of being laughed at. But as I painted more, I became less afraid. People learned through trial and error. Mistakes aren't frightening. What's frightening is not having the courage to start over. So even if my paintings didn't follow the rules, I could confidently set up my easel and gradually refine my work. Today's lakeside autumn scene was no exception. When I first finished it, I was dissatisfied. The colors weren't bright enough, it lacked contrast, and the scenes didn't connect. But I didn't give up on it. I took out my brush and painstakingly applied paint, trying to correct it to match the scene in my mind. Until sunset, I finally set down my brush, rubbing my aching waist, feeling a sense of relief. I stared at the painting in front of me and finally smiled in satisfaction. Finally finished. It turned out great. You've improved a lot since your earlier works. I initially thought this girl had messed up her painting. I was scared she would be shy and hide it like when she first arrived, so I didn't dare to look. I didn't expect her to end up painting so well. I looked up to see a group of middle-aged men and women gathered around me. They were commenting on my painting. They acknowledged my progress, teased me for being shy when I first arrived, and encouraged me to keep going. Surrounded by them, I pressed my lips together and smiled. So what if I made mistakes in my painting? My brush wouldn't stop. It would always adjust according to my wishes, crafting the result I wanted. Even if it was hard, even if the final result wasn't what I envisioned, I kept moving forward, heading toward what I desired. My life is the same. The autumn in Bee City is short. In the blink of an eye, snowflakes began to fall. It was cold enough that everyone reduced their sketching outings. I also started painting at home for my own amusement. To document my progress, I began a non-face revealing livestream while painting. I often talked to myself during the livestream. This color seems off. I should use this one instead. Not bad, the picture looks much more harmonious now. Hey, this piece has good contrast too. I must be a genius. As the live stream continued, I gathered a few hundred fans. They often came to chat with me while I painted, listening to my musings. Two usernames stood out to me in particular. One was Star1, and the other was Baby. Star1 was one of my first fans after I started streaming. Baby joined more than a month later. The reason I recognized them was that they loved to send me gifts. No amount of persuasion could stop them. They were the top two supporters in my stream. Moreover, they seemed to know each other and often argued in the chat. Star1 liked to lecture me, affirming my efforts while critiquing my paintings. Baby, on the other hand, was much more adorable. Even if I made mistakes, he would close his eyes and praise my work. So Baby often took issue with Star1's critiques of me. The two of them would often engage in verbal sparring. Baby, do you even know how to paint? Quit pointing fingers and stop being annoying. Star1, at least I'm better than a kid with no elementary school diploma. Baby, you talk too much. No wonder you're single. Star1, well, your mom ran off too. I watched their conversations during my breaks, often left speechless. But no matter how much they bickered, they always stood united when it came to defending me. Whenever someone disrupted the live stream, egging me to show my face or insulting me, the two of them would band together to confront the troublemaker and protect my stream. I didn't live stream to make money, so I kept a casual attitude about it, but I still felt touched by their support. To thank them for standing up for me, I offered to send them paintings I created myself as gifts. I smiled and asked them to send me their addresses, but the back end remained silent. I thought they might have stepped away, so I messaged them separately. Thank you for supporting me all this time. If you don't mind, please leave your address, and I'll send you one of my latest favorite paintings. That day, they didn't send any messages in the live stream. It wasn't until I was about to end the stream that I received their addresses. Coincidentally, both of their addresses were the same, and even more coincidentally, they were in the city I had escaped from. I stared at their IDs, and an absurd thought crossed my mind. Then I couldn't help but laugh. How could it possibly be the two of them? One of them is probably enjoying his newlywed bliss. The other one is probably celebrating having a high-class mother. The next day, despite the heavy snow, I went out. I went to the local market and bought some famous specialties from the northern part of the city. Then I sent those specialties along with the promised painting to them. When I got home, I didn't rush to take a nap. Instead, I opened my stream and set up my easel. I sometimes wondered if Star1 even had a job. Every time I started a stream, he was always the first to arrive and say hello. On the other hand, Baby felt more like a student, only appearing mostly in the evenings. I glanced at the chat and responded to Star1's greeting. I've already sent the painting. Make sure to let Baby know. After that, I went back to painting. When I was out earlier, I saw a heartwarming scene in the snow, a father laughing heartily, a mother wearing a red scarf, and their round, chubby child holding their hands. The falling snow, the soft ground, and a happy family of three. It reminded me of my parents and me long ago. Back then, I thought I had to come home and capture the scene on canvas. I focused on brushing the paper, painting what was in my heart. Ding dong, the doorbell rang. I frowned, put down my brush, and went to open the door. Standing there was my neighbor. He was smiling warmly, flashing a row of white teeth. I saw you had a package at the mail station. It's a bag of rice, and it looked pretty heavy, so I thought I'd bring it over for you. I looked at the bag of rice in his hands and remembered the fragrant rice I had ordered online a couple of days ago. I thanked him and was about to take the bag inside, but the neighbor, being overly helpful, wouldn't let go. Where do you want it? I'll carry it in for you. I smiled awkwardly and pointed to the kitchen, asking him to place it there. Then I gratefully offered him some water and held out some fresh fruit I had bought that day, insisting he'd take it. After seeing him off, I returned to my easel. As my eyes swept across the screen, I noticed a barrage of messages from Star1. A man came to your house. Who is he? Why was he there? What's your relationship with him? I picked up my phone and saw that he had also messaged me privately with the same relentless questioning. The last message read, Stacy, answer me. Who is he? I blinked, finally confirming his identity. Star one was indeed George. That meant baby was Henry. I didn't answer his questions and closed the live stream. I didn't understand what they wanted now. Could it be that after I left, they finally realized how good I was? If that's the case, then they're both pathetic. For several days, I didn't stream again, and I was relieved that I hadn't included my specific address when I sent the painting. If they really wanted to find me, it would take some time. But I didn't expect to see them again so soon. After staying home for a few days, just as I was about to go out for a walk, I opened the door and saw George. He was holding Henry's hand. The two of them stood there, staring straight at me. After pouring Henry a cup of hot water, I sat across from George. I stared coldly at him as he surveyed the room with a serious expression. "Why did you come looking for me?" Henry, holding his glass, sat on the couch with a sullen face. Their expressions made me chuckle sarcastically. Once George confirmed there were no other men in the house, he relaxed a bit and softened his tone. "Stacy, it's been a long time. How have you been?" I frowned. Cut the crap. Henry's school break is coming up. He wanted to see you. Henry was the child I gave birth to. Whether he liked me or not, I had a responsibility to take care of him while he was a minor. I looked over at Henry and asked softly, "Do you want to stay with me?" Henry took a small sip of water and shook his head with a stiff expression. "No, Dad forced me to come." I lowered my head with a bitter smile, then looked at George mockingly. "Don't use the kid as an excuse." George's face darkened, and his voice grew cold. "Henry, speak properly." I couldn't stand watching him scold the child anymore, so I interrupted with a sneer. "Could you stop putting on a show in front of me? And one more thing, we're divorced. You shouldn't be bothering me anymore. If Henry wants to come during the holidays, have someone bring him over. As for you, I don't think we have any reason to meet again." George opened his mouth as if to say something, but his face suddenly fell. "Stacy, I don't understand. I didn't cheat on you with Regina. We were just friends. I swear what happened that day won't happen again. From now on, I'll put you first in everything. Why did you still divorce me? You used to love me so much. You even hurt your leg saving me. What happened to you?" I exhaled slowly and turned to face him. "Did you really marry me because you loved me? If you truly loved me, why did you save Regina first when we both fell into the water? Why did you take Henry to play with her, tell me to accept her? George, don't tarnish the word love. It's disgusting." Seeing George's face turn pale, I couldn't help but pour out all my years of frustration. "George, I did love you when I was young, but when I risked my life to save you from that car accident, I wasn't doing it to make you feel grateful. I would have done the same for a stranger. But what did you do? You didn't love me, yet you stayed out of guilt, pretending to care for me. Did you think you were making it up to me? Do you still think you're the victim here? My parents always taught me to be kind, but when I found out you pursued me and married me out of guilt, I deeply regretted saving you that day." George stared at me, stunned, his eyes red. "No, I loved you too. I just realized it too late." I took a deep breath and pointed to the door. "That's not my problem anymore. Please don't bother me again." Henry was the first to walk out. Before he left, he gave me a long look. I felt a pain in my heart and called out to him, "Henry, do you want to stay with me for a few days?" That look was full of attachment, but he still firmly rejected me. "No, I don't stay in small houses." His cold words made me wonder if the attachment I saw in his eyes had been an illusion. After they left, I leaned against the door, sighing deeply with mixed emotions. If Henry had stayed, I would have inevitably remained entangled with George. If not for his repeated cruelty, I would have been trapped forever. Later, I moved a few more times, but George always managed to find me. Given his wealth and resources, my whereabouts were likely transparent to him. Once I realized this, I stopped obsessing over moving. Instead, I chose to ignore him. After dropping Henry off, George shamelessly lingered around me. He often followed me when I went for walks, reminiscing about the past as if he were alone. Stacy, when we were kids, we often took walks like this. It feels just like back then. When I was invited to sketch outdoors, he would drive behind me, trailing along. I would set up my easel and paint while he watched silently from the side. After I finished, as usual, he'd bring up childhood memories. When you came to my house, you were always carrying a sketchbook, just like now. I used to think you loved painting, but I never saw you paint back then. I didn't expect you to start again after all these years. One of my friends from the sketching group smiled and asked me, Stacy, is that your boyfriend? I shook my head and said seriously, no, he's my ex-husband. We're divorced. He's just pestering me. Then I explained the story behind our divorce. After hearing it, they were all furious on my behalf. When George followed me again and began to disrupt a sketching session, they teamed up to keep him away from me. Their dislike for him was written all over their faces. I was touched, but I told them there was no need for that. He'll be leaving soon. There's no need to act like this. Besides, I've already moved on. I was right. George did leave quickly, prompted by work affairs. Before he left, he looked at me intently and made a promise. I'll come find you once I'm done. I love you. I smiled but said nothing. No matter how many times he came, I wasn't going back. His love, coming so late, was like expired fermented milk, so foul it made me sick. Later, just as he said, he came back a few times, bringing Henry with him. He even tried to use Henry to persuade me to reconcile with him. Can you bear to let Henry grow up in a single-parent household? You love him so much. Why not give him the best? But unfortunately for him, he had done such a good job brainwashing Henry. Henry raised his eyelids and said coldly, Dad, you can marry Aunt Regina or find someone else to be my mom. When George glared at Henry, I couldn't help but laugh. Then I closed the door, leaving them outside. After Henry ruined his plans a few more times, George stopped bringing him along. He started traveling back and forth between the two cities alone. He kept repeating his apologies, his declarations of love. I remained unmoved, sometimes even laughing at him. Over time, his visits became less frequent. By the 5th year, he stopped coming altogether. For some reason, maybe he got tired of it, but it had nothing to do with me. By then, I had become a well-known oil painter in the country and had started dating my former neighbor. And when I decided to marry that neighbor, Henry surprisingly came to see me. He was 12 by then, already like a little adult. He handed me a bouquet of red roses, his gaze deep and dark. Mom, I wish you happiness in the future. Then he shoved the flowers into my arms and turned to leave without looking back. As I watched him go, I grabbed the hand of the man beside me, feeling a little stunned. It's been so long. He seems to have grown up a lot. The man wrapped his arm around my waist and patted my hand reassuringly. Yes, time flies. Later, on my wedding day, I saw Henry again. I had invited him the evening before the wedding. He didn't refuse, nor did he accept. I thought he wouldn't come, but that day he showed up in a little black suit, escorting me in my white wedding gown, step by step, toward the groom. On the stage. After placing my hand in the groom's, Henry leaned toward the groom's ear and whispered a threat, hurt my mom, and you won't have a good ending. The last one is already lying in the hospital. You'd better watch yourself. The groom hurriedly shook his head, promising, I will love her forever, protect her. I swear on my life. I turned to look at Henry. His face was stern, eyes red, as he fiercely warned others not to hurt me. I couldn't help but shed tears. Maybe Henry didn't really hate me back then. After all, when he was 5, he truly loved me. Perhaps his love was about letting go. George's perspective, 7 years into my marriage, Regina came back. I admit I was a bit shaken. After all, she was my first love, the one I loved with all my heart when I was young. But I never thought about leaving Stacy. Yet, during an accident when I instinctively chose to save Regina first, Stacy asked me for a divorce. For a moment, I panicked, but then I relaxed, thinking she had nowhere to go. She had loved me for so many years. She couldn't possibly leave me. Besides, there was Henry. He was her beloved son. Ever since he was born, even I had to step aside. So, I was certain she was just angry and would get over it. After all, she wouldn't leave Henry behind and walk away from me. But this time, I gambled wrong. Stacy really didn't want me anymore. She even left Henry behind. I got drunk and called her, asking her to come pick me up. I thought a few days had passed, and surely she had calmed down by now. She'd definitely take this chance to come get me. But she didn't. She repeatedly emphasized that we were divorced. Suddenly, I felt like things were slipping out of my control. That night, I returned home devastated. In the living room, I saw Henry playing with the Rubik's Cube Stacy had bought for him. When he saw me come home, he glanced at me coldly, then lowered his head again. At that moment, an idea struck me. That night, I took away Henry's blanket. The next day, as expected, he caught a cold. I didn't believe Stacy could just leave a sick Henry behind. She'd definitely come. Excited, I asked the housekeeper to call Stacy. To avoid angering her, I even went out of the house. Before leaving, I told Henry to make sure Stacy stayed. Henry raised his fever-flushed face and silently nodded. Satisfied, I left. I thought Stacy would come back and beg me to remarry her for Henry's sake, but once again, I was wrong. Stacy didn't come back. She left the city and returned to her parents' hometown. That's when I realized I might really lose her. Later, I hired a private investigator to find out where she was. I discovered that she had fallen in love with oil painting. She made new friends. She even started live streaming. Blindly optimistic, I thought maybe after some time to relax, she'd come back. So, I watched her live stream every day. Henry found out and started watching every night too. I figured he must have the same hope as me. He wanted Stacy back. After all, Stacy wasn't just mad at me. Otherwise, why would Henry fail to convince her to stay? Like a farmer waiting for a rabbit to run into his trap, I waited for her to change her mind. I thought I had enough patience, but when I heard a young man's voice in her livestream, I realized I couldn't wait any longer. Blinded by rage, I demanded to know who he was and what their relationship was. Stacy ignored me and simply ended the livestream. She must have recognized me. What was worse than that was she still wouldn't forgive me. I realized I couldn't sit around anymore. I bought a plane ticket and dragged Henry with me to the northern city where she was. On the plane, I repeatedly told Henry to tell his mom to stay. Henry looked at me and sneered, shaking his head. I grabbed his shoulders and demanded, "Don't you want your mom by your side as you grow up?" Henry gazed out the window at the clouds, his young voice cold and distant. "You don't treat her well. Instead of staying with me, I'd rather see her free." I froze, my eyes widening in disbelief. "That's impossible. She belongs to me." Henry, very smart and with strong opinions even at a young age, stared at me coldly. "Give it up. She's long been disappointed in you, and I won't help you trap her." Later, we met with Stacy. Just as Henry said, she refused me. He kept his word too. He didn't try to convince Stacy to come home. He even used hurtful words to push her further away. I refused to let go, clinging to her desperately, but she treated me like I didn't exist. Until 5 years after our divorce, I finally couldn't keep it up. I became seriously ill. Henry stood by my bedside and sneered, calling it my just deserts. Struggling to sit up, I stared at him for a long time. "Did you purposely make her angry back then so she'd leave us without any attachment?" Henry, only 10 yet already so mature, gave me a cold glance, his voice chilly. "After that woman came back 5 years ago," Mom cried. "A lot behind her back. Especially at night, after putting me to bed, she'd hold me and cry her heart out. She wanted a divorce, but she couldn't bear to leave me because she knew you wouldn't give her custody. She struggled in pain for a long time and became haggard. I loved her so much, and since she wanted to leave, I made sure she could go without any burden. You're right, I did it on purpose. But it wasn't at all because of you. I stared at his precocious face, dazed for a long while. I had wondered why Henry had suddenly changed. He had always been so attached to Stacy, loving her and clinging to her. How could he possibly dislike her and treat her so coldly just because of a few words from an outsider? It turns out everything made sense. He did it so Stacy could leave without any burden. While my heart ached, I couldn't help but speak with a touch of sarcasm. But you've lost her too. Henry immediately flashed a gentle smile, the kind he only showed in front of Stacy. As long as she's happy, that's all that matters. Oh, and I have some good news for you. She's getting married soon. She asked me to attend her wedding. Patient heart rate is abnormal. Did you say something to upset him? You need to leave now. We have to start the resuscitation. In the chaos, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the nurses and doctors rushing toward me. Henry, however, remained calm, walking out of the room leisurely. After being scolded, then I could neither hear nor see anything anymore. Endless darkness and silence engulfed me. I really started to regret everything. If I could go back to the beginning, I would have saved Stacy first. That way, she wouldn't have left me, right? Henry's side story: George passed away when I was 15. After his death, with my grandfather's help, I gradually took over the company. Once I successfully took control of the company, I went after that mistress's business without mercy. The woman who had caused my mother so much pain came begging for my forgiveness. She kept pleading for me to spare her out of the bond we supposedly had when I was young. What bond did I ever have with her? The one that broke my mother's heart? The one that took me away from my mother? I shook my head coldly and crushed the Lin family even harder. Eventually, she went bankrupt, and I took over her company. When I learned that Regina had fallen into $1 billion debt, I was kind enough to keep her at the company to repay it. I even made sure to assign the very employees she once bullied to be her supervisors. But within a few years, she couldn't take it anymore and ended her life. So boring. Honestly, learning how to run the company was painful, but if I didn't, I wouldn't have been able to protect my mom. I wanted to give her the best of everything. In the past, I pushed her away so she could be happy. Now, I work hard to ensure her happiness. Even if her current husband ever treated her like George did, I'd be able to use everything I have to provide her with a safe harbor. I wouldn't act cold and distant like I did when I was a child, causing her to leave heartbroken.